Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you may be sitting. And wherever that may be, we hope that you're safe and that you're healthy. Thank you for joining us today. So today's presentation is sponsored by Exostar, a trusted leader in secure business collaboration, and by Verify. Today, over 150,000 aerospace and defense organizations and government agencies in over 150 countries trust Exostar to strengthen security, improve productivity, and help them achieve their missions. Verify, with boots on the ground in over 50 countries, helps organizations across the aerospace and defense industry reduce risk and ensure supplier performance. Well, my name is Stuart Itkin. I'm Vice President for Product Management and Marketing at Exostar. And joining me as presenters today are Chris Carter, Vice President Technology and Compliance at Verify, and Matt Rupraskis, Director of Supply Chain Risk and Category Management at Lidos. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items to make everybody aware of. So today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, including time for questions and answers. And questions can be submitted at any time during the presentation using the chat window. But with over 4,000 registered for today's event, we may not get to everyone's question. So questions received will be compiled, and an email responding to those questions will be sent to everyone attending today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and can be replayed by visiting the link on the screen. And finally, due to social distancing, we are broadcasting this event live from several locations. And in the event of an interruption, we ask for your patience. If the stream doesn't restart after a minute, please refresh your web page. So despite skepticism when CMMC was first announced in the spring of last year, the DoD has marched steadily and deliberately toward the implementations of the milestones it had set. A lot has happened, a lot is happening, and a lot's going to continue to happen. And today we're going to provide an update on CMMC and how it has evolved, as well as an update on DoD's plans to roll it out. Chris Carter will present the results of a readiness assessment conducted by Verify on the state of organizations in the supply chain to the DoD, and share a view on what this all means for suppliers and what they need to be doing now. Matt Rupraskis will give us a prime's eye view of supply chain risk, how Lidos looks at its suppliers, and what suppliers should be doing now. The good news, you're not alone. Successful cybersecurity will result from a partnership of government, primes, and their supply chain partners. Well, two common themes you'll hear, just not in the next 50 minutes or so, but from across the industry are, well, first, it's important to start preparing for CMMC now. And second, for CMMC to be successful, for cybersecurity to be successful, you need to look at it from the perspective of risk, not as a compliance initiative. And let me start by setting the stage and why using a risk lens rather than a compliance lens is so important. And I'll start with a story. So last year, my son, who's a graduate student, decided to move from the dorm and to get his own apartment. And when he found a place he liked, I helped him with the lease. I also helped him with the security deposit, and then suggested he get renter's insurance. And when the agent came over, she said the insurance coverage required having a deadbolt lock. So we got in the car, we made a trip to Home Depot, and we bought a deadbolt lock, the cheapest lock we could find. We bought a Kwikset brand, which I was told is the most common lock in America. And then I thought about what was at risk. What would be lost if someone broke in? There was a PlayStation, a television, a printer, a monitor, and his laptop. And those are all replaceable. But then there's the information on the laptop, class notes, papers, and projects at various stages of completion, research data for his thesis, and drafts of sections of his thesis. What were they worth, and how replaceable was all of that? So I started to wonder about the Kwikset deadbolt, the inexpensive Kwikset deadbolt. And I did some research. Pretty interesting. Did you know there are 5 common attack vectors for defeating a deadbolt lock? Any deadbolt lock. So Picking a lock is kind of classic. It's what's done in the movies. It involves two small tools, one to apply turning pressure to the cylinder and another to push each tumbler inside until the lock opens. The second is called raking, and it's similar to picking, but instead of pushing each tumbler individually, there's a special tool that pushes two or more tumblers at the same time, making the process, I guess, more efficient. I guess that even burglars are concerned about productivity. The third is bumping, which is the easiest way to compromise the lock. Bumping requires a special key called a bump key. It's kind of a master key, and a bump key for a quick set lock will open 90% of those locks that are in use today. Fourth is a pick gun. This is a manual tool. It's commonly used by locksmiths. And finally, there's drilling, which is self-explanatory. It's also the only one that's detectable, and some could rake the same lock repeatedly, taking only a small amount each time and potentially go undetected. So I did some further research to see how vulnerable different deadbolt locks were to these attack vectors. Some were 3 times the price of the one I bought, stood up to all of these attack vectors fairly well. Well, how did my lock fare? Well, when tested by 4 professional burglars, now retired, I'm told, the average time it took to pick my lock was 7.1 seconds, to rake it about 7.7 seconds. Bumping was instant. A pick gun took only 3.8 seconds, and drilling, on the other hand, was noisy. It took over 2 minutes and probably just would have been faster to kick the door in. So you know what I did? I brought the lock back and I bought the most expensive one that they had. Why? I had complied with the requirements of my insurance, but when I thought about what was at risk, I realized my son was not secure. And unfortunately, it seems that the same applies when it comes to cybersecurity. And having worked for dozens of cybersecurity companies, I've come to understand the competition. And unfortunately, more often than not, our biggest competitor is the cheapest alternative that enables someone to check a box, to be able to simply say, yeah, I've done it. Are they compliant? Absolutely. Yeah, are they secure? Well, just ask your favorite pen tester about that ultra low price deal on PC-matic endpoint protection. You'll still be able to check the box. So one reason that CMMC was introduced is because compliance, it hasn't worked. The CMMC PMO, Katie Arrington cite $600 billion a year in CUI that is exfiltrated by our adversaries. And by the way, that CUI, that intellectual property, it probably belongs to some of you on this webinar. You spent your money to create it. It's probably why some of you are in business. 2 reasons why compliance, hasn't worked. One, with a lack of enforcement, some organizations just haven't bothered. And second, well, when DCMA audited primes who said they were compliant, who thought they were compliant, DCMA found that 18 of 20 weren't. Why? Perhaps the criteria they applied were different from DCMA's. Perhaps they didn't fully understand the controls they were supposed to implement, or perhaps they just graded themselves leniently, gave themselves kind of the benefit of the doubt. Well, CMMC is going to change that. It changes the process from self-attestation or grading your own test to third-party certification or having independent assessors apply a consistent set of criteria for grading everyone's test. Second, it's no longer about compliance or have you implemented something like bought a deadbolt lock. It becomes a matter of have you implemented something, are you using it appropriately, and how well is it working? And finally, it's not optional. CMMC certification will be a requirement to participate on any DoD contract, and the level that you need to be certified at is going to be a function of the information that you exchange. And if you look at CMMC as a risk mitigation, as a means of protecting the intellectual property that you've invested in to create, protecting it with a better lock, then what better time to start than now? So with that, let me introduce Chris Carter, who is Vice President of Technology and Compliance at Verify, where he oversees Verify's internal business and technology groups and works with Verify's customers on their strategic supplier performance management initiatives. Chris earned a Master's of Business administration from Pepperdine and is active with several industry cybersecurity committees, joint government industry working groups, and law enforcement and industry cooperative efforts. Chris will tell us where DIB organizations are on this journey, how CMMC and DoD's plans are progressing, and what you should be doing now to be prepared. Chris, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stuart. I was a little distracted by your story there. That was a great metaphor that I may try to steal in the future for some of our discussions. Well, as we get started here, one of the key things that I believe in really is context, and why should you listen to what Verify has to say about this topic? And so I want to add a little perspective. First off, for those of you who aren't introduced or aware of Verify, we're not just a new organization that's appeared out of nowhere. The organization's about 43 years old, been working inside of both commercial and defense for aerospace, and then also other defense aspects. We're active in either directly or in mid-tiers of just about every prime's supply chain throughout the US, and then with our international business units involved in many other countries as well. And what we're doing is really bringing about supplier performance management with these supply chains through boots on ground, as Stuart referenced, in 50 or so countries, using on-demand resources that can engage as necessary, as opposed to the prime or mid-tier having to engage their own folks and deal with travel or specialized skill sets that are not always necessary. And a lot of folks, kind of the first question that comes up is, what is supplier performance management? And rather than reading to you all the details of what we do, I think the examples that usually resonate the most with folks are, we're performing assessments around readiness, capabilities, risk. We're on site performing audits, inspections of work product, whether it's finished product or during process, through to supplier development, management of those suppliers, managing cost with those suppliers relative to supplier funded initiatives, and then corrective actions to get those folks back on task if they're off task. Next slide, please. And what I wanted to do as we start talking here is share with you a little bit about what we've been garnering from industry. I mentioned that we're active inside of these supply chains, and that could be just on the service level, but there's also deep industry engagement through like the working groups that Stuart mentioned, but also just the relationships we have inside of these organizations at all tiers. And what we were observing, and this really is the lead into the conversation, was when we had the DFARS 7012 clause that we'll talk about more, as that was evolving, as DCMA was doing their audits and starting to become more visible as far as what they were looking for in supply chain, and even before CMMC was really a household name, to Ms. Arrington's credit, what was going on, the conversations that were really happening in industry around cybersecurity and securing the supply chain, and the NIST 800-171 standard. And in these conversations, oftentimes behind closed doors and non-attributional because of the folks and the topics being discussed, these themes seem to resonate. So I'm going to talk through a couple of these because I think this is important to understand what maybe the joint mindset may have been as CMMC was really being birthed or coming to the public forum. And in talking to these groups, I think the key to really understand is how much variability there was even before we were in CMMC. So we're talking about the DFARS 7012 clause or the NIST 800-171 standards of who and how it applied to the different parts of the supply chain. And then as you start to go a layer deeper is, well, who really is the defense industrial base? We've heard numbers of 300,000. I've heard numbers of in the millions. We've got international implications. And from Verify's perspective, we're working in some supply chains that are 12 layers deep. And do the primes actually have a good sense of where they're at, both geographically and what forces are pressing down upon them, which really leads into these suspicions on what's really going on for cybersecurity. What's in place. Stuart gave us some examples of some discount solutions that maybe have checked a box. We talk often about coloring the corner of the box and whether or not that gets you fully in the box or not, or if you have to circle in the entire or fill in the entire box. The next piece, and this was really conversations that started around kind of competition or co-opetition was the word I was really looking for there, for contract privity on whether or not the primes or mid-tiers want to expose their unique supply chain. Now, they share a lot of suppliers, so there's often a term used of the supply web, because a supplier may be working for multiple parties, or sometimes a prime is working for another prime. But you've got this idea of wanting to maintain what's yours, what's your competitive advantage for your supply chain, yet to accomplish a lot of what CMMC is asking for, and really just risk management in general, you need to have a good sense of the supply chain. And that's really this term, supply chain illumination, that's being used more and more. I can't take credit for using that. I've been asked in the past, but I've heard quite a few folks, including those in DoD, really stressing this term. With the illumination, now that you know who you have and their current status, really comes this accountability and risk awareness that has to be addressed. In the past, whether it's through compliance slowdown or annual reps and certs, a prime to a supplier may have had them attest to their compliance to any number of standards. Now that we have to know, or we're being asked to be accountable for, and you have the illumination to tell you where it's at, there's this risk transfer that's happening. And at the end of the day, really what we want to ensure is that we're not killing the industrial base as we do this, right? Not putting undue pressure or requirements they just can't adhere to. And that's, national security is not something that anyone on this call or in industry is arguing, but it's figuring out, how do we do this? What are the implications? How do we support them as they go through this process? And the hypothesis that came from our group as we were really talking about this is that this really isn't just a cyber change. It's fundamentally changing a lot of how supply chain is working, or at least what's visible on the outside for most folks, to incorporate cyber as a fundamental aspect of supply chain risk. You'll hear that kind of throughout the rest of our discussions today, but it involves changing who's at the table. And even as we were leading into CMMC, a lot of the conversations pre that involved mostly technology folks, CISOs, things of that nature, who are providing tremendous value, but at some point that subject matter expertise start transitioning to where it's a supply chain problem. And that's, and what's involved in it. And that's really what I want to emphasize there. And then secondly was the hypothesis was that the supply chain was not uniform, that there were going to be a whole host of challenges based on, like I referenced earlier, geography or size or access to resources or where they are in working with the industrial base, that were going to have to be taken into account. With this hypothesis, we went back to industry and champion this initiative to work with Aerospace Industry Association, NDIA, as well as ExoStar. And if we go to the next slide, we actually went to industry and we wanted to start getting real data to find out where they were so that we could start driving some of this visibility and not force them to fess up, using my air quotes here, as far as what their actual status was. And so we created an anonymous survey. You're available to leave your information or request information at the end. It's non-technical. A lot of the assessments that are out there today are really about controls, but we want it to be a more business level conversation, such that anyone in the organization could give us some interesting data and help us work through it. So earlier this year, the survey opened pre-COVID, and we received several hundred respondents, all different sizes. I don't have the makeup here just for the sake of time, but we asked them a number of questions to really find out where they were on the road to CMMC. And by doing so, we were asking really where they were with the current DFARS clause that they should be accepting today. Now, we did have a number of respondents that were not current DIB participants, so we pulled those out to make sure that we were just dealing with current and active participants. And I just want to talk through a couple of the interesting charts here about where they stand today. There's additional information that will come, we'll talk about more later, but these four that I have on the screen here, I really want to just talk through. And so if you look to the left, what we asked them was, where are you right now? Where are you on the road to NIST 800-171 compliance, which is one element of the DFAR 7012 clause? And we segmented the responses by total revenue, not by total revenue relative to DoD, but total revenue to give us a proxy for the size of the organization. And if you look at the red, for those of you who are watching this in color, not printed it out, the red on the far left of each of these scales are those folks who have indicated they've completed all of the 80171 compliance. The conversations we have with suppliers, there is some suspicion on whether or not complete is accurate, just because of a lot of the POAMs that are in place or even the lack of understanding of the controls. But we'll leave those as is for now. Then we've got in the blue, and these are the tallest columns across the board here. These are folks who are actively working their plan of actions and milestones. So they're working on the process. And then in green, we've got early, and the questions we asked there were really about, have you completed a gap assessment, or are you in that process? A significant number of folks were actually in that process right now. And then I left in the purple, which folks who couldn't respond to this question, or the not started, which we do have a few responses in there, which are a little bit scary because these are folks who have indicated they already are a DIB participant. Now, the piece we just highlight here, and I don't think this is going to surprise anybody, was really how many folks are in the POAM status, so the blue columns, and really emphasizing that there's quite a few, or not a lot of people who are completed yet, but are on the journey, and we need to make sure that we continue providing them resources, move them along towards the end, because with CMMC, and I apologize if there's anybody on here who doesn't know all the requirements of CMMC, but with CMMC, you can't be working on compliance. With CMMC, when you become certified, you will need to have all of your open items completed. So we need to get these blue columns down to nothing and get everybody over to the red so that we can show that these folks are ready to be certified. I'll move to the top right to the incident response plan. And this question was the second part of the DFAR 7012 clause, which asked about incident reporting. And our proxy questions here were around whether or not the organization was organized in such a way that they knew what an incident was, they knew how to handle it, and they had, if you look at the green one, an incident response plan plus a medium certificate, which is the requirement to fill out the information for the DoD. Very similar statistics as we saw in the 80171 compliance, where we have comprehensive. So these folks, the question was really around, do you have a improving, constantly managed incident response program? And then the green was, do you have a plan and do you have the tools to do it? So I would really say that these red and green are the folks that are compliant today based on their shared information. Again, we have this blue column that is alerting us that we have folks that are still in the works. These are the folks that we're going to need to help move along. And then more concerning would be if we had any silver on here, which we don't show on this graph. So that's a positive for us. So that's looking backwards on where folks were relative to the DFAR 7012 clause and getting ready for CMMC. Then on the lower left, we asked them where they assumed that they would be certified at to move ahead. And I don't know if there's anything surprising here. What we were sensitive to, and this may be just a factor of the population, so we're going to look at this a little bit more, is how few level ones we had represented. When talking with DoD and talking with other industry folks, there's such a great expectation that the majority will be in the level 1 position where they're just receiving federal contract information and not receiving controlled and classified information. So there may be some data discrepancy there, but I think it's still important to look at where folks think they need to be at, and highlighting these level 4 and 5, which based on early discussions should only be about 1% of the total industrial base. So there's not quite driving data here. We're going to continue to look at it, but I want to share it because I think it's important to know where folks perceive they will need to be on their journey. And then the bottom right, this could be demographics, but I think it's important to look at this, and we'll talk about supply chain risk a little bit more, is looking at those folks. And so what we asked them was, as a percentage of their total revenue, how much was received through defense-based contracts? And what we have here is red and green are those folks that are low revenue relative to their total work. And we've, as we're talking with primes, highlighted these red and greens as far as folks that are of concern for us to move, as a kind of a flight risk area. So I'll move on from there. Next slide, please. Great. So I'm just going to touch on a couple pieces on here. I think the importance is that you can look at these resources afterwards, but key themes, we asked those folks what challenges were reported to them. The top one I'm going to cite here was the fact that they had a number of changing requirements. CMMC is hoping to address that and move this forward. And then if you look at the survey data, I think key things in here also is CUI is a major element, whether it's through commercial off-the-shelf folks or lack of clarity on what's being received. We'll expand on this when we release this data later. And then the respondent comments on the right, we've got a number of free text comments that we will speak to. But again, it's cost, it's ambiguity. CMMC's, the accreditation board is doing a great bit of work right now to reduce this ambiguity. And I think they'll address this. The last one that I will highlight is international implications, which continues to be a work in progress. We'll reference this, I think, when you guys get the slides afterwards. There's a lot more data here to be digested. Let's move to the next slide, please. So where are we at? And what we've got on this slide is a handful of things that are going on. And I just really wanted to provide you this as a reference data to look back on and kind of just highlight a couple of things that you'll see in a visual, it's on the next slide, of where we are in the process. So government, they've got a number of things that are both completed and underway. There's drafts that are out from different folks. I mentioned DAU on there. You know, I'm happy to see that the Defense Acquisition University, they're training their internal staff relative to what to expect. There's some great information to see there. We know the DFARS rule, there was an update this week that should be up for comment here in the next couple of weeks. And then this week actively is the NDAA for 2021 is in markup, and we're seeing quite a bit of CMMC related content in there. We have seen CMMC language in a couple of RFIs that we can talk about. The accreditation body also this week, a tremendous amount of data available on their website that can be discussed either Q&A or we can help you find that information in the future. And then industry's reaching out in any number of ways. There's a lot of resources. I think the key piece to understand is there's a bit of convergence happening, whereas there was a lot of scatter going on. It seems like progress has been made from all different fronts. And I'm going to talk to the timeline impact on the next slide, if we will, and I'm going to use that visual to kind of talk you through where our progress is and where we should be thinking about compliance. So on the left, we've got a recently released visual on where the accreditation body is in their process. On the right, we have the DoD's intended timeline, and they include the AB, what their process is as well. But what we see happening, if you follow these two and kind of run them out, is we see a convergence happening in this winter-spring timeline. And why I say that is the DFARS rule, which has been delayed to some extent by COVID and trying to get folks together so we can actually have commentary and discussion around the DFARS ruling. If that happens as we expect, and I think there's discussion around it for late summer after comment period, the DoD folks are intending to have RFPs start appearing in the October-November timeframe. If that happens, then we'll have the normal bidding processes. And what they're telling us today is that you will not need to have compliance until award. So that pushes us then again into the winter spring of 2021. So all good data. I don't think there's any surprises in here, and there's not been a lot of push. So I think we're in good shape as far as the progress going on there. But I think if we move to the next slide, I'm going to touch on just a couple of key areas of advice we have for supply chain on both sides, and then we'll turn it over to get Matt's perspective here in a moment. What I would say, and this is conversations that we have with suppliers and service providers at all fronts, is where and when do you go out and get a professional involved? The key piece here is that we don't want people to wait. You know, even though that time frame, is showing us winter spring, there are estimates that you've got 6 months potentially of work to do depending on the size of the organization. And as far as getting professionals involved, I would encourage the suppliers here to really focus first internally on these areas we've got highlighted as far as scoping, really understanding what your business is doing, what data it has, much like you would have hopefully done with privacy or health records or credit card records, anything of that nature, you know, GDPR, PCI. And then only when you have a good sense of where you're at, what data you have and where it resides, engaging these professionals to help you with the security controls and how they apply. At the end, at the bottom on the far left here for suppliers, we talk about managing relationships. I think the key here is you don't have to receive all this information. What you should be looking to do, and I'm speaking to the suppliers in this regard, is you should be looking to reduce your footprint of where CUI resides, where your exposure is. And frankly, this doesn't have to be just CUI, it doesn't have to be federal contract information. It should be your own secret sauce, where your financial data is. You should be having the same exercise. Professionals can help you tighten it and manage that and reduce the risk, but it's your job first to really start that negotiation on where does it need to be, what processes could you prune or adjust. Similarly to the primes, and we have these conversations all the time, and this will be interesting going forward, is can they reduce what they're sharing? And do they know who they're sharing it with? And we talked about supply chain elimination a little bit earlier, how to reduce maybe access to those high-risk suppliers. Performance is another aspect that we're seeing integrated in, and I think Matt will touch on this. And then really what can you offer to your suppliers? What are the opportunities you can do, innovative ways or non-conventional ways? We've seen some examples of that already in action, but we'll carry on from there. Next slide, please. So the readiness assessment is still live. We're going to keep it going here for probably another couple of weeks. You'll be provided this link after this discussion. We'd love to get your feedback, and we'll be sharing those results with the respondents as well as to industry and the DoD folks. Stuart, back to you.
Great. Hey, Chris, thank you very much. And I just want to remind everyone that the slides as well as a replay link will be available on the ExoStar resource page. And at the very end of this presentation, we'll put that link up on the screen for you to be able for you to see. So next, I'd like to introduce Matt Vipraskis, who's Director of Supply Chain Risk and Category Management at Lidos, who's going to give us kind of a prime's eye view of supply chain risk. And Matt has led all aspects of supply chain for Lidos, including enterprise contracting, material procurement, subcontracting, P-card, material management, logistics, and financial forecasting. Matt has also led technical solution development and supplier management strategies. Matt is a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or the IEEE, and the Association for Computing Machinery, or ACM. Matt is a certified PMP, a Six Sigma Green Belt with a degree in engineering and a master's in business administration. So Matt, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and to have the opportunity to speak just a little bit about the perspective that prime contractors in this space have regarding CMMC and risk in general within the supply chain. So just a quick note about Lidos, if you're not familiar with us, we are a Fortune 300 integrator focused primarily on the defense and government industries, but with some commercial components as well. We aim to make the world a safer, healthier, more efficient place through information technology, engineering, and science. And we have a fairly extensive supply chain reaching all the way from the Antarctic support contract to deliveries to the International Space Station and around the world. So this is a big part of what we do, and we take CMMC and the implementation of it very, very seriously, and it's a great opportunity to be able to speak to you. Now, as Chris mentioned at the beginning, this is a cyber challenge, but really the overall thing that we're trying to solve with this particular implementation is the overall reduction in risk to the supply chain. And this stuff on this chart here is just sort of to reset it a little bit. I know a lot of this is fairly common to folks, but I did want to put this at the forefront here and highlight the fact that the continued globalization of the supply chain, both within the labor market, software development, product delivery, all of that accounts for just adding further and further risk vectors into the performance of any contract, more particularly with US government-facing ones. Gartner has done a number of surveys recently. The links are down here in the bottom if you're interested in perusing them in the future. But a couple of things that popped out to me. A published survey from a year ago found that of the companies that they surveyed, 89% of them noted that in the previous 5 years, they'd experienced at least one cyber event related to their supply chains. Something within that network resulted in a cyber event that was negative for the company. And looking to an even more current instance of COVID-19 response, Gartner is finding that over 50% of legal and compliance leaders in the businesses that they survey are concerned about increased cybersecurity risks through their third-party providers. So disruptions such as COVID-19, there's a number of ones that I list down here below that go beyond cybersecurity to include natural disasters, tariffs and other geopolitical uncertainty, foreign ownership. These are all different elements that go into adding risk to any supply chain, particularly ones for the US government, obviously. And what we are doing as part of this is to try to take one of those elements out. And I'll go through a little bit more detail specifically about how primes are seeing this and augment the types of data that Chris was able to provide earlier. So if you want to go to the next chart. When we look at supply chain risk, we get asked on a frequent basis, we being prime contractors, a number of things about what risks do we look for and how exactly do we identify and mitigate those risks. So there's really 4 key areas that we focus on that are ones that I'm sure you also focus on in the engagements with your suppliers. And that starts with financial and legal risk. This is anything from the financial stability and health of your firm to your compliance with laws and regulatory positions, and ensuring that they are in line with what we have expectations of and what we are looking to do for our contracts. Performance risk, of course, this is a very important element about past performance history on work with us and other members of our community, as well as the likelihood and the ability to perform at or above that level in future contracts. Ethics and reputational risk. When you're doing business in the modern world, any engagement with another firm naturally lends itself to a public partnership, and ensuring that both sides march to the same set of ethics standards helps protect the reputations of both. And all of this together can all be augmented by that overarching security risk. And while this conversation highlights a lot of issues with cybersecurity in particular, that includes things like personnel security, facilities, counterfeit abatement receipts. All of these other areas that do influence the security of our engagement and do, as a result, also trickle down to how the company processes and positions itself relative to cybersecurity in general. This quote in the middle from Ellen Lord is one that I really like and wanted to highlight here, and that cuts to the heart of what we're talking about, and that's where it was said that attacking a sub-tier supplier is far more appealing than tackling and attacking a prime. And this highlights 2 key elements for me. The first is that it's a big tent approach to dealing with this risk and cybersecurity in general, from a partnership between the customers, the primes, and the suppliers and subcontractors in the arena. It really is a concerted effort to monitor every aspect of this in order to protect the program, the customer, and the delivery. And in addition to that, it highlights, for me as a prime contractor, the fact that I do have a very significant responsibility in making sure that this type of a program is implemented. So as was mentioned earlier and has been mentioned in the past, we've been living in a world of self-attestation, where essentially there was a communication back and forth, and a firm just needed to sort of acknowledge that they had in place certain minimum set of standards, and that was sufficient. And what's happening now is primes are going to be required to put a significant more effort into understanding the flow down of data and the pushing of data from their customer to themselves and out into the different levels of their program supply chain, to be able to ensure the protection of that data, as well as to make sure that it is going to folks that need it truly in order to perform the duties of that. And a lot of that is going to rest solely on the prime. So it's both. It's the fact that the primes have a heavy responsibility, and in addition, it's a big tent approach. When it comes to specific methods that we use, I'm sure this is fairly consistent across the board for many of us, but the specific tools will differ. We, of course, look at past performance history that we collect internally. Industry tools are a big part of it. ExoStar is one example of an instance which provides us a lot of visibility into our supply chain and risks. Recognized certification programs. This could be anything from ISO to AS to now this program, as well as certain cybersecurity or other industry certifications and credentials. And then, of course, published research and industry associations like AIA, Institute for Supply Management, and university published research are big parts of how we identify and mitigate risk within our overall supply chain. And again, this program is going to be inserted into this as another key component of mitigating that risk. Go to the next slide. Augmenting what we spoke about, what suppliers should do now. This is a very common thing that seems to come up in a lot of different areas of life, but prepare early and embrace the journey is the key statement, right? So when we were looking at the survey results earlier, the movement of getting from point A to the completion is that overall journey, not the destination. That's the most important aspect of it. And what we need to do is ensure that as an industry, we're consistently moving along as deliberately as possible in advance of contract award. It don't need to be done now, but we certainly need to be moving in that direction, both from a decision point of how we're going to, or how you and your business are going to make that move, as well as, of course, implementing it and coming to the end of a certification and receiving a credential. And as a big part of this is primes have a role in supporting those certifications. We're not necessarily looking to be putting out investments. We're not looking necessarily to be partnering to that deep of a level, but ensuring that there is enough information flow between us and our supply base so that they can understand the requirements, keep up with changes that are occurring, be connected to credential bodies in the future if that is something that they're interested in proceeding, and then helping them to understand the landscape of what our bids are going to look like and the free flow of information that's necessary for them to perform their work is all a part of understanding and preparing for it. The middle bullet here is the key thing to stress, and that is that you need to ensure that you are only seeking the certification level that is appropriate for the business in which you operate. So it's an introspective examination and looking to be certain that you're not going too far and putting in too much of an effort to get a higher level credential than is necessary. It's been stated frequently that the expectation of the government is that the majority of the base will be in the lower tiers, in level 1, and level 5 will be just a small percentage of the overall population. So it is weighted heavily downward, and it's encouraging folks to not necessarily pursue complex and expensive certification levels. The way that you can ensure that this is happening is by looking inward first, understanding the kinds of data that you receive, that you have, and what data you actually need in order to perform the duties of your roles and your business plan. In a lot of cases up until this point, there may have been data that's been free flowing to levels that we did not necessarily, that isn't necessary. Folks have been pulled into areas that is not their core competency, and understanding what you need is the key aspect. Looking internally first to get that picture, and then pivoting to look externally to the types of contracts you want to chase in the future, the work, the growth that you're looking for your business. That's the steps to take, is internal, then external. And what you can also do is work now to reduce the amount of information that you receive from your customer or from your prime as part of a business or process requirement. Asking why I am using or getting this information as opposed to what do I really need it is really the area to focus on. So that is a big component of the discussions that we have from a procurement organization with our supply base is to make sure that we both are in agreement of the level of information that you are receiving is correct, and the location in which you're providing that service, whether it's on a Lidos or a government site as opposed to your own infrastructure. These are all decisions that we need to discuss and will derive you to the correct certification level for that business. When you're talking about looking for guidance, of course, it's certainly with prime partners. It's of course with companies like Exostar and Verify to help you get an understanding of the types of things that are changing within industry. And it's also, I would encourage you to look at places that may not immediately come to mind, like these third-party research firms and universities. I have up here an example of one recent publication that was through the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. It's a white paper research document that was sponsored by Lidos covering supply risks in global supply chains. And what they did is interviewed CIOs from across multiple different industries and derived their guidelines on 4 key fundamentals for managing risks within supply chains and published them in this document through the Haslam College of Business, the University of Tennessee. This is free. It's in the public domain. The link is here in the chart, and you can also just go to the Haslam School website, and it's located on there. I would encourage you to take a look at that, and there's others also as one area, and it can help you get connected to other experts within industry and within universities like the University of Tennessee, which is a leading supply chain research institution, as well as having a solid engineering program as well. So opening up the aperture to be certain that you're looking at all sources is certainly a key area. We go to the next slide. And finally, just to foot stomp again on the fact that the partnerships between us as an industry is a key part of this. Successful cybersecurity truly is a partnership between the customer, the prime, and the subcontractor. As you need to be diligent about ensuring that you're receiving the proper certification, getting the support you need from us and others within industry, and moving along deliberately to receive that credential in advance of a contract award. Primes also must be held accountable to clearly identify requirements and solicitations to you, work with our customers to get that level of granular detail as early as possible. This is still a work in progress, so it's not going to be completely smooth up front, but that's the position we need to get to help you make those decisions. And also to ensure that we're maintaining that competitive environment for solicitations. As a procurement professional, my #1 task is maintaining a compliant and competitive landscape for any appropriate bidder to compete for the business that I'm needing to outsource, whether it's parts or people. CMMC, as has been noted, does provide this holistic and agnostic certification platform that we'll be able to use to augment our risk identification and risk mitigation programs that we have internally. In an ideal world, it will simplify that qualification process. It will make it easier, faster, let's say, to identify appropriate collaborative partnership opportunities. But we recognize the fact that this is not a straightforward thing. There are requirements. It requires capital and time investments to comply. And that's going to drive decisions within your business about where you want to move. And so the prime concern that a lot of us express is, how does that translate over to a business and market environment? As you make the best decision for your business, I am also attempting to make sure that I have a fully competitive environment with a large slate of companies from which I can go to. And so it is in the interest of primes to be able to help you gain that certification, to be able to continue to have that broad base for us to flex and utilize for any kind of requirement in an upcoming contract. And we want to be engaged in that process. We want to make sure that you feel comfortable in bidding, and we want you to be able to perform at the level that you feel is appropriate for the business and the market in which you operate. That is all I have.
Well, great. Matt, thank you very much. And As I mentioned, we've received a lot of questions, kind of a steady stream of questions that are coming in, and we will provide, we'll kind of paraphrase those and provide a summary and answers to those questions in an email to everybody who's attending sometime towards the beginning of next week. Let me start to get through some of the questions. A lot of them are common, so I'll probably paraphrase a couple of them. One that is pretty common: is there a list of authorized certification authorities for CMMC? Chris, maybe do you want to take that one?
Sure. So one of the components that the CMMC AB is putting together is a marketplace of those folks that are registered and have some basic understanding, a uniform understanding that'll be available. So that would be on the cmmcab.org. That site's coming together now. But I would start there. There's quite a few folks in industry who have background in 800-171, which is a lot of the underpinning, but there's not an official list relative to that standard.
Great, thanks. So Matt, I mean, there's been a number of COVID-related questions, and so let me try to summarize them. Do you expect CMMC's practices or their processes to be modified or expanded as a result of COVID-19? What's going to change, I guess, is really what it comes down to.
So this is something that we're also asking a lot of questions about, is to understand exactly what the impact that COVID will have both to the rollout as well as any fundamental change in the direction of the program. From our perspective, it's possible that a delay could happen. Chris mentioned it earlier with regard to the rule being implemented after the comment period that will happen in the near future. This isn't going to be significant or fundamental, but it may sort of delay it slightly. We don't anticipate any significant changes to the overall implementation program. In the long run, though, it's going to consistently move. COVID is a challenge. It's certainly a risk, but it's not something that's going to fundamentally change the cyber landscape.
Got it. And will it change the timeline that DoD and the CMMC accreditation body is on to be able to implement and roll out CMMC requirements?
I have not seen that, Chris. I'm not sure if you have a different perspective.
I think the only specific delay we've seen for CMMC is on the DFARS ruling update. But as far as the accreditation body, the progress they're making, the draft documents, the provisional work that they're doing, the pathfinders, those all seem to be progressing. We'll see if there continues to be challenges relative to travel, and on-site pieces, but we've also seen the DCMA's audits have evolved to adjust to travel restrictions and such. So probably not significant, a little bit, but seems like they're agile in what they're doing right now to meet the needs.
Right, and as I said, kind of at the beginning, every more than a bit last was announced. DoD and the pretty spot on relative objectives they've. So, you're interested in the industry. Result of the information you've heard.
Yeah, Stuart, I'm sure you had a great question there, but I'm getting pretty choppy results there. If you want to maybe pause your video and try that abbreviated again.
So we try that data you've got with three.
I think, Stuart, you were asking, sorry, we broke up there a little bit. I think you were asking about the survey data and whether that was going to be shared. The rest of the data, the raw data, as well as what our observations are coming together into a white paper. Those are intended to be out mid-July, early mid-July. We do have the survey open. We'd like to get some additional feedback in there from this audience as well as others. But the data we have even now is we've seen the kind kind of erratic responses have kind of normalized.
You and both early in that. Would you recommend low-hanging fruit and those savvy?
I did not get that question, Stuart. Could you try again? Okay, so it looks like we're pulling questions for a chat. Chris, I just to continue.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, to continue the discussion of that survey, the results are very, very interesting. I assume it's got quite a wide adoption. Is there further interest in or timing that you guys are going to have in terms of projecting it outward?
Well, so we're talking. So we did this first as just a shotgun approach to industry to see what we could get. We're talking with a few primes on whether we might tailor the questions specific for the, their supply chain, and maybe modify it that's a little bit more targeted towards those respondents, or just evolve it. But I think the good information there, we have representation from all tiers, all commodity segments. We're a little low on international representation, and that'd be one area that I'd love to see expansion.
Great. Hopefully I'm back at this point if you can hear me.
We can.
You are. Thank you.
Excellent. Good. Thank God for backup systems. So Matt, you'd mentioned reducing sensitive data or not accepting CUI that an organization doesn't need. What does a supplier need to do to make sure that happens?
So first of all, the main thing is it needs to be appropriately marked. So if you're receiving data that is marked as CDI or CUI, you need to be able to it is only truly marked or appropriate if it's marked that way. What I would do is want to have a conversation with the prime or with your customer about whether this is truly data that is necessary for you to perform your work. If it is something that's come to you for history, because it's a nice to have, or it's the kind of thing that's augmented and supported the work that you've done, but isn't necessarily directly related to the job, it's worth the question of whether or not this is the type of information that you actually do need to receive. Because lessening the overall footprint that you have will lessen the requirements in the future, and it will allow you to be more flexible with that overall certification level to perform the same level of work on government contracts in the future.
Great. Time for one last question. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, we just want to piggyback on that for a second, because you've got the relationship between the supplier and the customer, but you've also got internal cultural awareness. In our role, we see data, I don't want to use the word leaking, but coming out of organizations in ways that were unexpected. And so whether you're a prime or you're a mid-tier or you have any supplier at all, it's really, you need to work on the internal folks to make sure they understand that not just the CUI, but what federal contract information, or again, any of your sensitive data inside of your own organization, and start dialing up a notch just what that awareness looks like so that everybody's participating. It's not just the compliance folks or the cyber folks that are responsible for this.
And to piggyback further and take it another step, you can also ask, what is it about the document that you receive that makes it receive that classification? It's possible that they could take the document, adjust it, pull out some non-critical pieces of information, and that will reduce the overall classification level to just to something that is much easier to transmit and will lessen that further burden on you. So that's another area to focus on, is trying to get the information adjusted or changed to a lower classification level.
And that's interesting. We actually have one of the suppliers we work with asked us last week if we had a way in our supply chain platform of specifically sending a message to everybody saying they do not accept CUI, don't send it. They wanted to obviate the problem in that respect. So I think we have time for one last question, and let me kind of paraphrase you both suggested suppliers prepare early and that they seek guidance. So where would you recommend they start? Is there any low-hanging fruit? And I know that, Matt, you shared some resources, but are there any other resources you might recommend for suppliers, especially those that aren't technically savvy?
So a great way or great places to start are certainly with universities who have helped design this program in its entirety, as well as firms, just to plug Verify with Chris, like that are able to give you guidance on where to go to receive consulting services if you do not have the confidence internally to be able to implement them in this way. The challenge that we have is that as these standards are still in development, getting a firm understanding of where specifically what it's going to look like in the future is slightly changing. But there is enough information out there to allow you to build up a plan moving forward, and we can point you in the right direction if that's necessary. Chris?
Great. Yeah, I worry a little bit. We've seen a bit of snake oil being sold in industry, and hopefully that's reducing. There are quite a bit of resources available through the manufacturing extension partnerships in each of the states, through the Small Business Administration run programs. I won't say there's a plethora. Most of the primes have created resource sites with links to specific information. I know the ND Isaac group has put together a great resource list. There's almost too much information, maybe, or too many opportunities for information. I think the key is to go back to what your current requirements are today and what's more concrete, and that would be the NIST 800-171 standard, really understanding what you are obligated to underneath that, and then layering on, if you haven't looked at, there in the slides, you'll see the 48 CFR rules for federal contacting information that you should have already been doing, but we'll leave that alone. But then also in the 800-171 standard, looking at Appendix E in there, there's a set of non-federal NFO controls are called that are integrated into the CMMC, and just becoming aware of what those entail, a lot of which are process oriented, is going to help you get a lot further. And you're going to find more folks who are acclimated and I'll use word experts, but relative to the NIST standard than you will to CMMC, although they're really tied together, and you're going to find a lot of the information available underneath the NIST standard.
Great, thanks. And yeah, everyone can also find information available on the ExoStar website, as well as links to other external resources, I'm sure on the Verify website as well. So with that, I want to thank our speakers, Chris Carter, Vice President of Technology and Compliance at Verify, Matt Vispraskis, Director of Supply Chain Risk and Category Management at Lidos, both of you for sharing your perspectives and insights with us today. As I mentioned, a replay link will be emailed to all participants early next week, as well as a link to download a copy of today's slides. And you can find ongoing updates and insights about CMMC at www.exostar.com/CMMC, as well as information on tools to help you prepare. And so again, thank you from all of us at ExoStar, from Verify, and on behalf of Matt and Lidos, thank you all.